Hey everybody, Marcus here. I have with me Dr. Gregory Sadler for yet another interview. Dr. Sadler and I have discussed anger and friendship in two previous videos, and today we'll be tackling justice, but more specifically, justice as it concerns law. Now, expect this series on justice to continue into the future as Dr. Sadler and I discuss the various domains in which justice is an important consideration. But for now, let us get right into the heart of the matter of today's subject. So, Dr. Sadler, what is the purpose of law?
Well, so that's a good question, and it doesn't have just one answer, as usual. You can see this already in some of Plato's dialogues, where it looks like some of the interlocutors have very different ideas of what the laws are there for. But I guess ideally, you could say law is supposed to regulate all of our actions or our possibilities for engaging with each other in such a way as to help us realize the human goods and to protect them from being damaged or being taken away by other people. And that's already a lot right there.
Yeah, but you brought up Plato, and specifically in Plato, from what I recall, he's very concerned about the law as a tool for bettering the citizen.
Yeah, that's something that you see running through a lot of ancient and also medieval political theory. Is, people say, well, you can't legislate morality as if it's, a self-evident truth. And it certainly hasn't been in most cultures or even in Western culture for most of its time. Plato thinks that, law is kind of a risky venture. If you get it wrong, you screw things up pretty badly. So you create perhaps opportunities for people to behave in very bad ways towards each other and not get punished for it, and then to derive the lesson that, well, this sort of thing is a-okay. On the other hand, you can really be too strict with law and too prescriptive and prevent people from doing things that would be good for them, take away their autonomy. Ideally, the laws, Aristotle says this too, ideally the laws should be inculcating in us the virtues. And it's hard to see exactly how that takes place. They don't tell us precisely how that's supposed to happen, but that is an ideal governing ancient, I should say.
Yeah, and there's an interesting relationship too between law and punishment, because as we think of it, those two things always go hand in hand. But when we talk about Plato and Aristotle even, but specifically Plato, there's a very distinct way that punishment, there's a very distinct reason why punishment is administered. It's really to correct the moral quality within a human being.
Yeah, and it's for those who you can reason with, but they aren't going to be persuaded by reason, perhaps because their appetites are too strong or they are too motivated by power or honor. These things that Plato considers to be lesser goods that aren't genuinely good for the person in comparison to, say, having a virtuous soul. And yeah, he portrays punishment. I mean, some of the stuff that he says is so paradoxical that he puts in Socrates' mouth that he sets up his interlocutors by having Socrates say, "You're not going to believe what I'm going to tell you, but here it is." For instance, in the Gorgias, when he says that it's better to be punished, it's better to have somebody punished than not to be punished, and so you should wish that your enemies don't get punished and that your friends do get punished, because punishment for many people is the only opportunity they have for bettering themselves. On the other hand, it doesn't seem like punishment itself is enough to steer us towards the good. So there has to be something beyond just coming down hard on people.
But the concept in Plato is that punishment, as it were, is medicinal.
Yes.
It's a form of it would be a form of injustice not to punish somebody, not so much because the law demands retribution, but so much that you're hurting the individual by not punishing them.
Yeah, and Plato also has this idea that you don't see in Aristotle, that when people are screwing up, it's because they're fundamentally misguided or ignorant about what's genuinely good. They mistake sort of things that are good but not wholly so for being the good, and then they make their decisions on that basis. And so punishment is sort of like, steering the train back onto the tracks by giving it a good smack on the side. I'm not actually a big, I'm not that convinced that works that well, because in any given situation of punishment, it's possible to draw different conclusions from it, right? But the person who's being punished. So it may be intended to be medicinal, but they can easily draw the conclusion that, hey, this person just doesn't like me and they're being mean to me, so I should do more of what I'm doing. Or if the punishment isn't too bad, they might say, well, I really like the reward that I'm getting by pursuing this good, and the punishment isn't that bad of a price to pay for it. So you have to be very careful in applying punishment.
It's true, but let's take a specific example to see, that is ambiguous in itself, and see how this would fit into the reasoning, I suppose, of Plato or Aristotle. So take the example of a man who's very hungry and steals some food, right? Now, that sort of situation, from a procedural point of view, would demand a form of punishment, because no context would be taken into account of it, right? But that's not really how it would play itself out with Plato, would it?
Well, I don't know that Plato actually does discuss that example. That's one that actually came up a lot in medieval political theory. and the question was, well, should you punish somebody, say, and they'd make it even stronger. Well, the guy is stealing bread to save his hungry children who otherwise are going to perish. Oftentimes that would get framed in terms less of what would punishment do to the person, and more in terms of whether you should punish at all. And the way that they typically looked at that was, well, how should we describe the act? Should we say that the person is fundamentally engaged in an act of theft, or should we adopt the other description, which the person is probably going to be giving to the magistrate or whoever they're running into? I'm trying to save my children. Aquinas talks about this, and he says that a person who is stealing, who has no way of getting food in any other way, is not actually stealing, meaning that's not the best description of what's going on. You're right, from a sort of contextless out from the outside act, it's just stealing. But when you consider the context, it becomes better described as maintaining life, or nourishing one's children, or something like that. And I suppose if we think about what punishment is supposed to do, maybe sometimes punishment's function is to help us understand what kind of act we're actually involved in. So sometimes maybe punishment should be worse than what we think we deserve, because we think we're doing act number one, which isn't very serious at all. Oh, bullying, a great example, right? Bullies often say, oh, I was just teasing, just joking around, can't they take a joke? And then you find out that there are these very weighty psychological effects on the person who's being bullied. And so if we come down hard on the bully, maybe the bully then realizes the weight of their actions. That's getting a little bit far from Plato, though. But.
Yeah, no, the way I understood that particular example, which, I don't think is in Plato, actually, but it's interesting to look at it at least this way, is that if the person's motivation is to steal food, is because there's no other way for them to acquire said food. Let us imagine that they tried finding a job, there's no work available, or any other reason, that they've exhausted every opportunity to not commit that act. Then there's no real moral failing in that person. They do it out of hunger. But if that person is motivated, they have money and they have the means, or are lazy, and they steal, then there's some vice within them. There's either greed or there's some lack of virtue that is compelling them towards that. And the way I see from Plato, if you can pick up that the motivation is really a vice, then that demands correction within the individual, because you're not punishing them really for the act as much that the act exposes that vice, and you want to expunge that vice and lead them to virtue through punishment.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to put it. Oftentimes we talk about an action expressing a moral state in a person, because we can't actually look inside a person and see, you know, what the guts of their soul looks like. But exposing, I like that metaphor, that by engaging in a certain act in a certain way, and perhaps even by the justification that they give for it when they're caught, they show what's really going on, as we say, in their head, or you know, in the background. And yeah, there could be a number of different motivations. I mean, if somebody just says, "Hey, I want to steal from this grocer because I want to put that guy out of business," that's probably worse, right, than the person who just picked them at random. I'm not sure what we would make of the kleptomaniac, these people who say, "Well, I've got a compulsion to steal," or I do it. Oftentimes people say, "I do it because it makes me feel alive," you know.
Well, that would be either an absence of fortitude or an absence of temperance in that reasoning.
Yeah.
And so,
or wisdom, you know, wisdom, knowing what's good for you.
yes, and in those cases, then it would make sense to punish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's kind of, you know, if you think about it, how does punishment change a person inside? It would have to be accompanied by more than just the sheer act of depriving them or imposing some pain upon them. There'd have to be some sort of explanation that is then supposed to function as like a framing, you know. Here's why you're getting punished for this.
Yeah, I suppose the punishment would have to be reflective of the specific vice that compelled the individual, right? So if it was something to do with intemperance, and intemperance, you know, being that drive of the I guess drives of desire, especially of the flesh, of touch, and things like that. If it was something in that, then the punishment would have to be a mechanism by which that person would overcome that quality within them. It's kind of like a smoker overcoming like an urge to smoke, right? I guess if smoking was illegal in that sense, then the punishment would have to be something that expunges the urge to smoke.
It's hard to think of how that would work. I mean, I suppose we could put some good time into it, and people have done this sort of thing. You know, I guess one extreme of this would be, you know, what we see in not only Dante's Inferno, but also other books about hells, right? Where, like, I'm thinking in particular not about literature, but about like Chinese Buddhist literature, where you would have all these different hells. And unlike, you know, the Christian hell, where somebody is just getting punished, I suppose, in a sense of retribution for what they've done in a way that fits the crime, and they never learn the lesson. In all these, I mean, there might be 49 levels. There's different versions. If you're a counterfeiter, you know, you have this punishment for you, and it's something, I forget exactly what it was, but it had something to do with banknotes. And by the end of it, you should have gotten the lesson that this is a bad thing for you to do, you know. And so they would people put a lot of thought into how this would play out at an extreme. I live in those extremes. Those are fun to imagine. The question is, well, how do we modify people's behavior here and now, you know?
Well, if we talk about Dante's Inferno, I mean, one of the requirements of ending up in hell in Dante is that you have to be unrepentant. None of the people in hell actually acknowledged they did any wrong. They always blamed it on something. So they really kind of chose to end up in hell. It wasn't really something imposed upon them.
Yeah, and it's like I said too. I mean, once you're there, you're not learning anything, right? It's not as if spending an eon there as opposed to spending a day would make any difference.
No, hell.
Whereas, you know, if punishment is going to be serving some purpose, some educative or medicinal purpose, presumably the amount of time and the number of, I don't know, occasions or instances would play some role.
What's interesting, though, I never looked upon Inferno in Dante as actually punishment per se. It's just kind of the natural state of it's more of a representative of the being itself that ended up there. So everybody's quote unquote punishment was something unpleasant we would not want to experience when we describe it. But I don't think those people so much found it that way. Nobody really complained in hell.
Well, you're right. It is coming out of, it's sort of like pulling out the implications of the acts or the context of the act and the damage that they do to the human person. So if you're, if you're gluttonous, then this sort of aspect of humanity has been damaged in you, and you wind up in this state. If you're wrathful, this state. But coming back to, like, how we change people in the here and now without sending them into dramatic, never getting out sort of things. There has to be some sort of way to, unless the culture itself is supplying the explanation, you did this thing, and so here's the punishment you get, and if you don't want to get that, change yourself in some determinate way. There would need to be something in the mechanism of the punishment, the way it's administered, or an explanation that accompanies it. And if you think about, what goes on in our own courts of law, that's often what the judge is doing during sentencing, effectively, because we have this very complex procedure, and people are just sort of marched through it, unless they're very interesting cases, which usually involve a lot of money. But for the run-of-the-mill people, they're in and they're out pretty quickly. And I don't know that they learn an awful lot from the system.
No, I doubt that there's sufficient consideration of the individual and their state of being, I guess, internally, of the structure of their soul when punishment is dished out. More done in a procedural thing. It's, if you commit this act, then here's the range of punishments you get. On the low end, say, is 3 years in prison. On the high end is 15. But the judge is only working their discretion within those prescribed legal requirements that are imposed upon him. So even as a judge, you really don't get the full power you need to practice practical wisdom, to practice phronesis, to decide really what is the best course of action. You have to work within frameworks that were legislated.
Yeah, and you don't really have that many tools. You've got time you can take away from a person by sending them to prison. You can impose community service. You're going to go pick up trash along the side of the road. Occasionally, judges will impose some sort of, more punishment fits the crime sort of thing, but that usually raises an outcry here in the States. And then we have monetary damages. Now, in effect, here, at least here in the States, and I imagine it's probably similar in many other places, depending on where you're sending the person, you're indirectly setting them up for a lot of other hardships. But you're not willing those directly or in any reliable way. I mean, unless you had some sort of criminal context within the prison where you're sending somebody, and you could say, I want this thing done to this guy, you don't really have much to work with, just money and time. And then social censure. You can like shout at them, you're such a terrible person, I hope they never let you out on parole or something like that. But I don't know that makes much difference.
No, that would probably not really help anybody. Okay, but we've spent a lot of time talking about the perception of the purpose of law as it appears, at least in Plato and some of the early Greeks. Are there any other final causes, any other purposes to law that you can bring up from other philosophers from other time periods?
Well, actually, Aristotle has, when he's discussing friendship, Book 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he has this little passage about law, and he says that, or no, this is in Book 10. I'm sorry. He's talking about why we need laws to regulate human behavior and to correct things. And he says it's easier to hear it from the law than from some other human being, because if there's another human being, we might think that they're doing it because they're envious or they don't like us. But with the law, there's a kind of impartiality to it. Now, I don't know that we always have to think, well, who's actually enforcing the laws? So maybe there's partiality that slips in there. But the general idea seems to be, if we have a kind of agreed upon framework that goes beyond our interpersonal relations, we have less to complain about, and we're more likely to follow it. So I think that's an important function too.
It's interesting with Aristotle, specifically talking about not friendship, but the sort of lawmaker, right? So we've talked about
Oh
laws, we've
yeah,
talked about punishments, but who makes the laws, right? And
yeah.
I think the ethics works in itself naturally to be followed up by the politics, because in the politics, as I see it, is an expansion of friendship itself, and the things spoken of in the ethics. So I guess in Aristotle, it would have been that the lawmaker is the just man.
Hopefully. The other thing that's important to point out about Plato and Aristotle is that they're both intensely pessimistic in their assessments of the existing regimes of the time. And remember, Aristotle did all these sort of constitutional surveys of the Greek city-states. And in the ethics, he says none of them actually gave proper attention to how to educate younger people, except for Sparta, and they even screwed it up. In the politics, I think it's in book 4, he says none of the existing regimes are actually good. They're all like one step away from being a particular form of bad. And we see that with Plato too. The only truly good regime is this imaginary regime. Aristotle is a bit more realistic, but even he says most of the time what you get is a conflict in society between two groups that are not really looking out for the good of the whole. It's the many and the rich. And the rich would like an oligarchy so they can be in charge. The many would like a democracy, not because they actually want to take everybody's views into account, but they're interested in having their own represented. And the people who have the best cause to actually engage in social faction or revolution are the good, the aristoi. But they're also the least likely to do that. He doesn't say this in those terms, but you can think about these people as being those who are patiently suffering the nonsense of the many and the rich and holding it together and doing their job, despite the fact that these other people are tearing at the social fabric. They're the ones who hold it all together. And Aristotle thinks that that's about as good as it gets within Greek society. So I think you'd be even less happy about our current society.
Oh, for sure, and specifically going back to what you said with that type of middle person, the aristocrat, basically, at least the person predisposed to aristocratic qualities. And that's one thing that's interesting is that when people hear the word aristocracy, they're usually imagining wealth and royalty and things like that. But that's not really how this is used in Aristotle, or even when talking about aristocratic souls. It's not a matter of the topical aristocracy, the pomp, the showmanship, the status aspect of it, but it's a certain quality of being internally that the aristocratic man is the good man, and it doesn't mean that he has any money. He could be very, very poor.
Yeah, I think that's entirely right. It's a matter of the structure of their personality and their motivation and how they engage with other people. And if you do put them in power, one of the ways you can tell who they are is they don't do what the oligarchs do, or what people often think of as aristocrats. They don't just, reward their friends and punish their enemies and start to, get more and more power for themselves and say screw everybody else. They bend over backwards to make things work for other people. So somebody who would be a good example of this in ancient Greece was Solon. Who was appointed the task of rewriting the laws for Athens. Athens was in this huge debt crisis, and many people had been sold into slavery because of debt, and so there was a lot of social injustice going on. Solon rewrites the Constitution, and he does so in a way that doesn't please either faction, either the many or the rich, and that's usually a sign that you're doing the right thing. But he sticks to his guns. He actually leaves Athens, which at that time, think about it, it means getting out of your home country and going somewhere else. He leaves so that they won't have the opportunity of trying to bring pressure on him to change the laws, just so that they can keep them in place. I think he's a great example of that aristocratic lawmaker.
Yeah, which is very different even from today's standards of what a lawmaker is, an elected official.
Yeah.
For the most part, that there's a lot less concern with the quality of the candidate as a human being as it is much of their popularity,
Yeah.
which is very unfortunate. It would never pass with Aristotle or Plato as a candidate for a lawmaker.
Yeah. And so much of it is tied in with uh, less so, I think, in Europe, because you have a different type of system in place with parliamentary politics. But with our presidential politics and our federal system, it's these coalitions. And so we've got a Democrat coalition and a Republican coalition, and there are these various social forces that tend to vote along the same lines. And both sides engage in a lot of wishful thinking about what great people their candidates are, and how if they kiss a baby, that baby's going to go on to Harvard or something like that, and what diabolical, terrible people the other side are. And it's really hard to find somebody who can make it through the political system and become part of the political class who doesn't wind up becoming totally corrupted in the process.
I wouldn't necessarily say they become corrupted through the process as much as the corrupted rise up through the process.
Yeah, well, there's probably both of that going on. You probably need to be a bit corrupt to be attracted. Although, I mean, there are some people who are like, man, I'm going to get in there, and you shouldn't complain about the system if you're not getting in there to try to change the system from within. And then a couple of years later, they're the system, you know. So I think there's probably both of that going on.
It's
But, going back to like lawmaking, I think if we think about, so the Greek for law is nomos, and that can mean law or it can mean custom. And there's this whole range of institutions within our lives that form the way in which we do things, that are not strictly speaking laws, but they do have effects on our behavior. And so that could fall under that realm of custom. It's not directly political, but we could say it's social. I think a lot of people had great hopes for the internet to do that. I don't think we've seen an awful lot of increased civility or public consciousness through the internet itself. But there's different ways to try to get beyond just the strictly legal framework.
Yeah. Okay. There's definitely a lot we could probably cover from the educational aspect and these other influential forces like school or your upbringing. Discipline, for example, is
Yeah.
I suppose another word that we can use to describe this corrective action that is in spirit entailed in like Plato's notion of punishment for lawbreakers. So that could also be talked about. But which kind of brings us up to it. So we have things that are good that are also legally enforced. There's things that are bad that are legally enforced. So it brings up the question: are laws necessary for there to be justice?
Oh, yeah. So that's a good question. I guess one way to answer that would be to try to think in a utopian way about what a state of human beings would be like that did have justice and didn't have laws. And we do have a lot of people out there who try to imagine these sorts of things and sometimes even write books about them, but they don't seem to hold up all that well when you start asking more and more questions like, well, what about this case? If these people do this thing, how are you going to respond to that? I think we've got sort of a leftist version of that, and then we've got I'm not going to say rightist, but like libertarian version of that out there at these extremes. But if we think about our own experience, and we think not just in terms of what we've seen people do, but what we haven't seen people do because laws are in place, we probably do have to have law in order to have a lot of forms of justice. It doesn't mean that all justice would be simply reducible to law. I mean, that would be the mistake of people like Hobbes or other legal positivists who want to say, look, you don't have any justice outside of some sort of legal arrangement, or some arrangement of power at least. But but you could think of law as sort of like the skeleton that the flesh of justice gets hung on.
Okay.
You also need other things like a circulatory system and nerves.
Well, from Aristotle's point of view, at least, I mean, are laws necessary? I think he believed they were, because there's both just and unjust people. And it's the only society that I suppose, in that utopian sense, could exist is without laws, is a society that's only full of just people.
Yeah, and he doesn't seem to ever imagine that sort of society would ever exist. There's nothing like Plato's Republic in Aristotle. He does talk about the Cyclopses and the fact that they're all a law unto themselves, but he sees it as a terrible thing. If you look at what the Cyclopses tend to do, it's not a good thing. They're barbarians in the classic sense. Yeah, for any of us who are not beasts or gods, but human beings, we're stuck with each other socially, and so we've got to have something to regulate how we behave towards each other. If you were on the sort of imaginary desert island thing, and you had a very small band of people, I suppose they could behave like a family. But you notice that even the family, Aristotle has analogies between the way political regimes work and the relationships within a family. So the relationship between father and children should be a monarchical one and not a tyrannical one. The relationship between siblings should not be a democratic one, but rather a timocratic one. I don't think there's any way that you could round it for Aristotle.
Okay. And with talking about laws and their relationship to, say, morality in a distinctive sense, because we say not everything should be legislated.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which justice can exist without law, but there's other senses in which that we want the laws in place as well. So how do you imagine this distinction happening? Because many things that are illegal are also morally wrong, and there's a close association with that. So murder is not just illegal. It's not just a bad thing, but it's also a morally bad thing. So some laws are also legislation of morals, others are not. So where do you see this kind of line being drawn? What kind of sphere do you think that laws need to belong in, as opposed to justice in general?
Well, that's a tough one to answer, because I think if we sort of abstract away from how complex our social system and our legal system has turned out to be, even then, you're right. There's going to be like an overlap, and you might say an interpenetration between the moral or the ethical and the legal, so that one of the reasons why we should have laws of certain sorts is to make sure that moral norms or moral values are respected, like life, for example, or property, and there's various, it kind of depends on like where you think these rights come from. Like if you're a Lockean about property, you think that it comes from having, invested labor in it and made it your own, mingled it with your own property, which is your own body. There's other ways of thinking about this as well, but there's kind of a broad consensus across societies that you shouldn't kill people. You shouldn't try to, intimidate them. You shouldn't take their stuff. You shouldn't sleep with other people's spouses. You shouldn't lie. You shouldn't. You should treat your parents in certain ways. The things that actually go into the Decalogue, right?
But not everything is illegal on the Decalogue. Lying is not.
Well, it depends. Yeah, it depends on the context, and it depends on which society we're looking at. You're right. In most Western societies now, you can lie all you want. As a matter of fact, advertising is basically just an industry of lies in many respects, and that's completely legal.
Yeah, I think
there's certain.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the only form of lying that is illegal is perjury.
Well, no, they're fraud.
True. Yes.
When you sell somebody a product and you say that it's going to do something, and there's sort of like ancillary ways in which you can get in trouble with that, like mail fraud, right? You're committing fraud, but you're also using the mail, and there's a certain kind of lying because you're using, I don't know exactly the whole justification behind why we have it as a separate category, but it has something to do with like you're using a federal property to like give it some sort of imprimatur of authority. Lying can be part of that, but in any case, yeah, you're right. There's a slippage between the legal and the moral, and not everything that is moral is illegal. Not everything that is moral is legal in some cases, depending on how the laws are structured. Not everything that's immoral is illegal. Not everything that's legal is necessarily moral. Our two presidential candidates right now are perfect examples of that. They've both done things that are quite immoral, but are consistent to say haven't broken the law. It's debatable with both of them whether they actually have. Interestingly enough, it's a sign of how far down we've come in our political process. And so there's a slippage there. Ideally, you'd like to see that slippage less and less, but there are certain issues that come up with this. Thomas Aquinas is a good one for picking this out, and so is Augustine. There's some things that they're bad to do, they're immoral, but the amount of regulation and enforcement that would be required in order to rule them out would require so many sacrifices of other goods that it's not really worth it to do that. You might say you've got to let people have a certain scope of freedom, even if that involves screwing things up in these ways.
Yeah, what's interesting is kind of the influx in laws. So let's look at the days of, say, the mid or early 19th century in Russia, where you could still challenge somebody to a duel, right? Yeah. And a lot of conflicts were resolvable between citizens, and there was no real recourse to law for some of these things that people would challenge against in duels. What I'm starting to see as a category of laws that are forming are people's inability to resolve problems between each other and then delegating that resolution to the state. Whereas, and that's so strange because it seems to me like the worse that people get, the more laws there are in place.
Yeah. And the more laws you put in place, the more potentiality there is for the laws to come in conflict with each other, because they're usually not all made by, reference to the same principles or by the same legislators. And that opens up possibilities for abuse. Laws are supposed to solve social conflicts, but they become locuses of more social conflict. There's all of that going on. And then there's two other interesting dynamics. One is something that Gilles Deleuze points out in one of his essays, which I think is on, it's both about Kafka and Kafka's Before the Law thing in the trial, and about Billy Budd. And Deleuze talks about the function of law as keeping the majority of people in check, and they never really keep the total evil people from breaking the norms, because they'll do it anyway. You can put a law in place, and they're gonna. We're running into this sort of thing in how we're trying to make sense out of gun violence here in the United States. And again, on that thing, I'd like to say a plague on both houses, both the right and the left, because neither one of them is proposing really great solutions here. But the people who are willing to follow the laws are going to be kept in check by them, and they'll accept more and more regulation, and it will sap their vitality and keep them from doing other things. But the laws are the laws, and so they'll respect them. The laws never really protect you from the total monsters, because they'll just break them. It's like a spider's web to them. So that's one interesting dynamic. The other thing that's sort of along the lines of what you were hinting at, I think, is there's been this recent discussion about different ways of handling social conflict. So in an honor-based society, you have dueling. And there's a lot of things you won't say in an honor-based society that you might say in other places, because somebody will come along and say, fine, you want to say that, I'm going to challenge you to a duel, and here's the pistol, and maybe you're going to die today.
But you can decline duels, and that's the thing. Honor.
You can, but you lose something if you do, right?
Only if you respect honor, and that's the whole thing. Both participants have to value honor.
Okay, so there's that. There's the honor culture, and we still have a lot of that. I mean, you know, people settle things with fist fights or knife fights. There's still quite a bit of that in our subcultures in our society, but the majority of our society is based on a dignity culture, in which we do sometimes make recourse to law and to legal procedures, bringing in the state, right? But most of the time, we try to treat other people with dignity. We expect to be treated with dignity. You know, somebody crosses us, we actually express something to them. We might have to actually use force against them, but in many cases we don't. And then now there's been this shift to in you know, recent generations. A lot of people want to attribute to this current generation of you know, students, because a lot of this is happening on college campuses. But I think this really happened with the baby boomer generation. And then Generation X got sucked into it a bit. And I forget exactly what they call it, but we may as well call it the complaint culture. The culture that says, I'm experiencing a microaggression, therefore I should bring in the state, or whatever counts as the state, like the college.
The word for it, I think, officially is grievance culture.
Yeah, there you go. And the general idea is that, look, with a dignity culture, you had to develop as a human being certain resources, like being able to assert your own point of view, to hold your own against others. You didn't have to punch them like you would in an honor culture, right? Or you know, stick a sword in them, or at least defend yourself with a sword. But you do have to be on your own. There is some independence, some autonomy there. The shift to the grievance culture is really a worrisome idea, because it gives so much power to whatever it's going to be, the institution, the state, to decide, and they keep on like raising the stakes for what the punishment should be, and the level of offense keeps getting smaller and smaller to act as a threshold. So the number of possible offenses proliferate. It stifles actual conversation and discussion. Things that were I'm willing to go out on a limb and say perfectly, you know, within the realm of free speech and academic discourse 20 years ago. Now you got to be careful about if you're in the traditional academy. And I think something like that is going on within corporate structures as well, because they often tend to be either behind the curve or ahead of the curve. If they want to be proactive, as they always like to talk about, then they want to make sure that they're keeping in accordance with those norms, and it's usually HR that's leading the charge on that. And so nobody gets to say anything, you know. And I can understand, you know, some of the development. Telling ethnic jokes at work, probably a bad idea, you know, because looking back on it, there were probably a lot of people who were hurt, and not just offended, but actually, you know, in some ways hurt by that sort of stuff. Not being able to make any ethnic references at all, that strikes me as a real impediment, you know. And then we could multiply all sorts of examples of this, I think.
No, but this kind of brings us right into Nietzsche right here. And Essay 2 from the Genealogy of Morals, the nature, how Nietzsche traces back punishment and the origins of punishment.
Yeah.
How do you think that ties in as an alternative accounting to the purpose of law and why laws were put into place?
Well, that's one of my favorite features of that work. There's psychologists are getting it wrong, and let's talk about master and slave morality, right? And that's what tends to get the majority of the attention. And then of course the priest, because, you know, priests are always troublemakers, right? But this whole idea of punishment not being what the various theories of punishment out there have made it out to be, but somehow encompassing all of that and yet going beyond that as well, and being something that developed historically. I think he's right about that. It isn't just one thing, and whenever we try to turn punishment into one theory that we're going to apply in reality, it always escapes us and doesn't work. Foucault actually works off of that in Discipline and Punish.
But before you move on, could you maybe explain to the audience who may not be familiar, what exactly does Nietzsche have in his theory there?
Oh, so Nietzsche says that punishment is something that develops historically, and so it doesn't have just one single purpose. And one of the mistakes that people have made is looking at what we do in the present and sort of just reading that back into the past and saying that must be what they were on about. So punishment can have all sorts of different functions depending on which instance we're looking at. It could be just retribution and wanting to wipe the person out. It could be somebody wanting to try to in a Platonic sense, try to use medicine to cure somebody. And it's sort of like a dirty snowball, as it goes on rolling through history, it picks up more and more and more stuff. And by the time that it reaches us, it's not just one thing. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's two things specifically I want to bring up about that. The one, the imagery that Nietzsche uses in the second essay, punishment as a means of socially acceptable revenge.
Yeah,
that was very interesting. Whereby which people have a certain gain a certain pleasure out of just being vicious, and that punishment, when someone wrongs you, allows you to socially be able to enjoy that viciousness within you and gain that pleasure of it through the application of this punishment. So that's a particularly interesting.
I think that's still going on too.
Oh, yeah, the people that weaponize the law are definitely engaged in that.
Yeah. That's a good example.
And the other thing that's interesting that I want to say, based on what you were saying, is that if punishment itself has been picking up all these different purposes, I suppose, then if we look at how, say, Aristotle would have looked at the four causes, the final cause of punishment then becomes empty. It's like there is no cause anymore.
Well, it's not that. I wouldn't say that it becomes empty. I would say that it ends up having, it's like a Swiss Army knife. It has all sorts of possible tools, which from an Aristotelian perspective makes it much less effective. He actually, in the Politics, criticizes an instrument like that that's called, I think, the Delian knife, because it's not really just a knife, it's a whole bunch of things. But what it means from an Aristotelian perspective is also that punishment is always a matter of rhetoric. Rhetoric takes place where you have the possibility of multiple points of view, and multiple points of view about what's practical, what we ought to do, who's to blame, or what we ought to praise or criticize. And so punishment then becomes, this is kind of an interesting idea, I never really thought about it this way, but it becomes Nietzschean punishment, the Nietzschean theory of punishment, becomes something that's inherently rhetorical. So I guess the upshot of that is, like Aristotle says, we ought to learn rhetoric so that we're not
Hello?
punishment, which tried to like wipe out the individual in graphic ways, pull their guts out and, draw and quarter them, that sort of thing. Show that, if the king and his law are transgressed, we're going to get you, you SOB. Enlightenment punishment was supposed to be humane. And the way it was supposed to work was by using using reason, using logic, using signs that would convey to the person what their offense was and why they're being punished for it. And it turned out to be completely unworkable. It didn't actually produce the results it was supposed to produce, these prison reforms. And instead, what ended up happening is the human being gets seen as a possible subject for sort of mechanization, and punishment becomes something that you can do to a person by putting them, say, into a workhouse, or impressing them into the army, or any one of a number of other things which try to reduce the person to a machine. And unfortunately, that turns out to be very effective. That's where some of these massive armies in European wars got some of their core from. Well, navies too. They just send people out and grab people off the street at random. It's not even really punishment at that point. It's just sort of, cleaning up the streets is how they saw it. But none of this none of these are models that we actually want to have, I think. But the question then is, well, what would be effective for us? And we're always dealing, I guess you could say, we're always working against the tide. We've always got a whole bunch of other people out there who have all sorts of agendas in terms of punishment. Some of them wanting to make it more humane, some of them wanting to make it more about, revenge, or like you said, weaponizing the law, for whatever agenda they've got. And so I don't think we're ever going to have a case where we're able, if we want to say we rational people, where we're able to impose our will and make punishment do what we think it ought to do. We're always going to have something that's kind of second best or third best.
Okay. In terms of bases for the law, like in Plato and Aristotle, the basis for law would have been the concept of justice, and the lawmaker would have been the good man, I suppose. In terms of philosophy and how philosophers have used other models to base the law, could you name any other ones in history?
Sure. Sort of at the exact opposite of that would be what we call legal positivism, which says that whoever's in power makes the law. I mean, you see this with Thrasymachus, right, in the Republic, and Callicles in the Gorgias. So it's not a totally new concept, but the idea is that there really is no morality outside of some sort of power structure that imposes law, and the whole purpose of law is to keep order, maybe to allow us to enjoy some of the benefits, like Hobbes says. It's not just about keeping us from killing ourselves, but making sure that if we do engage in industry, we're not going to lose the fruits of it by somebody coming along and taking it. And that's as good as it gets. And any sort of, idea about morality, driving law, that's dangerous. As a matter of fact, in Leviathan, Hobbes tells you that in a state the way he envisions it, you don't get to read Cicero or Aristotle or Plato or talk about that sort of stuff, because that's going to be conducive to thinking other than what the Leviathan wants. And I think we can come up with a lot of other similar examples. When somebody says, well, it's just the law and you have to follow it, they're being kind of, I think, a naive legal positivist. Another way of thinking about it would be in a theological sense, where somehow the law is supposed to come from the divine. And there's different ways to do this. You can be what they call a divine command theorist, where maybe the Bible furnishes the laws, or the Torah is the law, or we get it from the Quran and the Hadith put together, interpreted in certain ways. And the idea is, well, God gave us laws and we just kind of go with those. But another prevalent way in which religious people have dealt with this is in terms of what they call the natural law. This idea that human beings were created with rational minds, so that we can make sense out of our nature and figure out sort of basic moral norms that should structure then the positive laws that we make. All of those would stem originally from, like for Thomas Aquinas, from what's called the eternal law, which is God. But there would be an important, human component to it, where we're doing the interpreting, we're talking with each other, working things out, saying, well, what would be rational? And then the legal system that's in place would be measured according to the criteria of the natural law. So if you have a legal system that is, say, making it legal for young people to just go out and kill old people, for the fun of it, that would clearly be a bad legal system from the standpoint of the natural law. And there's a number of other ways of thinking about this. Social contract theory doesn't have to devolve into what Hobbes turned it into. You can use that to try to figure out what the basis for law ought to be. Some people see the law as sort of inherently a locus in which we're contesting things with each other.
One thing I find,
go ahead.
I was going to say, one thing I kind of found amusing from your list is that none of your entries involve the concept of democracy.
Oh, well, you also have legal theorists who are like almost in love with democracy, and they see the legal system should, further that in some way, but they're never quite clear about just what is democracy, right? They don't want what's called an oligarchy, a mob rule, but one guy's mob is another person's progressive activists, I think.
Well, the one thing I always liked about the democracy as a basis for law, and democracy specifically, it's just narrow it down to consensus. Okay. That laws are made by consensus, and I always come back to Plato on this one. It was either it might have been in the Republic or in the Statesman or somewhere, where you're saying, like, when you're sick, you don't go to the shoemaker for advice as to your ailment. You don't go to the horse breeder for advice as to your ailment. You go to the doctor. But when you want to vote in laws or vote in who should be in power, you go to the shoemaker. You go to the horse breeder. You go to everybody.
Yeah. So there's an epistemological problem there about who actually has the practical wisdom to legislate well. Is it just a simple matter of it would have to be a really, really simple thing to do if anybody off the street is just as good as anybody else. So there's that epistemological issue. And then there's also the problem when you do that, of the fact that democracy never turns out to be democracy. There's a great work by this guy, Robert Michels, who is a German sociologist, 20th century guy. And it's called Political Parties, and in it he coined what he called the iron law of oligarchy. And it's been interpreted, it's mostly people who are like anti-democratic who read it these days, but it's well worth reading for its own sake. What he does is he goes through and he looks at a lot of institutions that are supposed to be progressive and democratic, like, say, labor unions or parliamentary politics. And he shows, doing case studies and then doing sort of an analysis, that what almost always ends up happening is an elite ends up taking power within that group and being the representatives. And over time, the interests of the elite diverge from the interests of those who are supporting them. And what starts out being democratic inevitably ends up being oligarchical. And I think he's fundamentally right about that. That's something that occurs even in supposedly leaderless movements like Occupy Wall Street. Either that happens or the movements break up and don't accomplish anything. So when somebody is like super big on democracy and we should always be democratic and it should always be consensus, usually there's a demagogue hiding in the wings, and we just got to watch out for them.
That would be related to creating an order of rank. And again, this comes back to Nietzsche again. One thing I always found interesting in Nietzsche's work, especially in the genealogy, when he describes an order of rank, that how it worked before. There was the lords temporal, the lords ecclesiastical, and the commoner, right? Yeah. And you had the commoner also had the merchants, meaning that the lord temporal would have been the dukes, they would have been the kings, the princes, the counts and all that, but they didn't necessarily have any money. Like, they were aristocracy, but they had that nobility about them. They were always throwing these parties for the commoners to keep them in line. And within the commoner group, you had the merchants, which were the wealthy. And the wealthy didn't like the notion that they didn't have any political power. So one of Nietzsche's criticism, and how this ties into what you were saying, is that eventually that whole hierarchy toppled, and a new hierarchy reformed, the current class system we identify, which is, when we think of class, we only really think of the economic class anymore. The upper class, the middle class, and the working class, right?
Yeah.
But that's ordering people in terms of money. But before, what Nietzsche was describing is that people weren't ordered. Yeah, people weren't ordered according to money. There were classes, but they were ordered according to like quality of soul. And and the merchants were kept down because their values were not reflective of the aristocracy.
Yeah, and I mean, Marx talks about this in a similar way too. He sees what bourgeois society and capitalism succeeds in doing is taking, he calls it in the Communist Manifesto, like a whole range of classes interpenetrating with their different duties and obligations and privileges, and it just collapses that whole structure. And everybody sort of ends up filtering into, and there's an idealism, of course, but filters into two main classes: the people who've got, and the people who ain't got. The bourgeois and the proletariat. And there's some holdouts like the petit bourgeoisie for a while, but it never turned out that way. There's always more to the system than that. But yeah, I mean, this is an important process that happens. And then we have societies like ours here in America, where there was a fairly deliberate decision not to have titles and a new aristocracy. And of course, we do have our own aristocracies, largely based on wealth that develop over time.
But that's exactly what you're describing. And what I was trying to get at is, if when you have an aristocracy based on virtue, like Nietzsche was trying to, in a way, defend and go back to, nobody would care about money in terms of ordering, I guess, people, some better than others, wouldn't be based on money.
Yeah, or wouldn't primarily be based on money, because you do need some like economic processes to be in place. And in the genealogy, so there's this interesting discussion of how justice takes place within the upper class, as opposed to what you owe towards the commoners, which turns out to be practically nothing. And so before like the age of herd morality, let's call it, right? Justice is primarily what happens in the relations between the people on the top of the hierarchy, or people who are trying to climb the hierarchy. Because if you've got some, you could be a commoner, but if you've got some some moxie, as we used to call it here, you could rise up and become a lord, and show yourself to be one of those kind of tough individuals. And so, what is justice between the upper class? It's always something that's negotiated. It's not just that they fight with each other and settle things that way. There's always it's force against force. And so at a certain point, they'll be like, okay, I'm willing to accept this amount from you for the fact that you took your troops across my fields and caused some indignity to me, as well as economic harm. And that gets lost as the masses rise to power. That sort of thing. Although we do see all this wheeling and dealing still taking place in civil law. What goes on between corporations, in how prosecutors here in America make deals to get people to take lesser sentences and lesser crimes so they can clear their docket. There is still a lot of that wheeling and dealing, rather than impersonal justice applies across the board to all.
Oh, but then now we're going into the distinction in Aristotle of proportional versus arithmetic justice. And that's an interesting subject that also lends itself well to any discourse in justice about equality.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and there's another thing too that comes up in the politics. Once again, we see the many and the rich is that one of the reasons why they do that is they both grasp justice, but only partly. So that the rich look at the fact that they're unequal with the rest of the people in terms of one thing, wealth, and they think that because they're unequal in terms of wealth, they should be unequal in other respects, like being treated like human beings. The many say, well, we all are free, so we're all equal, so we should be equal in all respects. And Aristotle says both of them are wrong. They're right insofar as they grasp, what the basis of their existence is. They're wrong insofar as they try to impose it on everybody else. So they're both jerks in different ways, and they're both equally unjust as a result.
Yes, well, equality is a very broad subject that I suppose we could do a separate video, maybe following this one, specifically
Sure.
just tackling equality. But going back to law specifically, if we look at, say, something topical, if we look at the Brexit referendum that's coming up in less than a week, right?
Yeah.
Let's see if we can look at that and what's happening there, because that does involve the people. It involves democracy, something a lot of people think is the best system available based on what kind of species we are. I suppose that there's nothing really better that's ever worked.
Or is
look,
the least worst, right? That there's that famous quote, democracy is the worst of all regimes except for all the rest.
what was it? That was Churchill, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we look at the Brexit referendum from a perspective of that, it's laws and it's people voting on them.
Yeah.
That wouldn't really ever be approved of in either Plato and Aristotle, would it?
The idea of like leaving a union once you've joined it, is that
No,
what
the idea of taking this massive vote of the whole population on such an important subject.
Well, I mean, you could in a democracy. That's what Athens would do during the Peloponnesian War to decide what their military policy should be. And it was usually a bad idea to do so because then you have demagogues like Cleon getting the populace all riled up, and then you send your fleet over to Sicily and lose them. So I mean, there is scope for that. Would Plato? I mean, in Plato's Republic, no, you wouldn't. You would never have the common people getting to vote on anything. It's entirely managerial. The guardians make all the important decisions. Although I don't see any reason why if you're going to do one noble lie, why not do another noble lie, right? Why not make the people think that they get to vote and then manipulate them behind the scenes so it just turns out that 75% of them just end up happening to support what the guardians want? Why not do that, right?
Well, I think that a lot of people believe that's how democracy is currently executed in many first world countries anyways.
Yeah, we're running. This is a bit of a digression, but this is probably the most interesting presidential election that we've had for a long time that I can remember, going all the way back, say, to I don't even think that the Clinton versus Perot versus Bush one square off was as interesting as this, because we have a lot of what looks like election fraud in various ways happening within the Democratic nomination process. So people are quite irate about that. We have a Republican candidate who's managed to alienate a lot of the Republicans, many of whom are filtering off to the Libertarian Party, which makes that a viable third party. Bernie Sanders may end up forming some sort of alliance with the Green Party, which would be a viable fourth party. It could turn really interesting, and people are turning out to vote in record numbers, in part because there are genuine alternatives, not great ones as far as I can tell, but at least from a philosopher's perspective, but very interesting choices to make. So it's a good thing, I think, overall, and that people start paying attention to it, realizing that our votes, our individual votes don't matter at all, but en masse they can actually produce a shift in this ship of state. I don't know how much of a shift, because A lot is controlled by executive departments in the United States. The secretaries presiding over, say, state or defense or things like that. And Congress itself is a mess. But to go back to the Brexit, would Aristotle think something like that could be legitimate, or
A referendum. I mean, it doesn't seem to
yeah,
be
I mean, in a democracy, you could have that. I don't think he would think it's a great idea.
Well, I suppose there was always voting in one sense or another, but it was heavily controlled. I mean, what did they have? About 500 people. I mean, from what I recall from
Well,
Aristotle saying that a democracy with a small group may function, but once it becomes a large mob, you don't really have a democracy anymore.
yeah, it tends to degenerate. I mean, he talks about 4 different types of democracies in the politics, and his ideal is similar to the one that we here in the States called Jeffersonian democracy, where you have these small farmers, and most of the time they stay home and they farm. They come to town, they vote, and there could be plenty of them voting, but they don't vote very often. And so it's kind of a managerial class that the archons who keep the business going, and they can always remove them if they want to. Um, so it is a democracy in name. When you have, like you're saying, mob rule, then that's one step away from tyranny. And sooner or later a demagogue is going to rise, and then they'll get voted in, and then they'll abolish the democracy. And that's what happened in many Greek city-states, including Athens, at different times.
Well, again, without deviating too much into, I guess, peripheral subjects, the specific, very laser-focused area I was trying to talk about was that legislating laws, and we started with Plato saying that you don't go to the shoemaker, you don't go to this person for medical things. So why would you go to all these people to make a law? And the Brexit thing I bring up is it is a law change, and democracy is an idea of going to absolutely everybody to get their opinion about something.
Yeah. I would say it's not just a law change. It's essentially, it's like a regime change, right? Because Britain is deciding whether they remain within the European Union in any meaningful way. And if you are within the European Union, now Britain's kind of a weird case, right? Because they kept their own currency and they resisted some other EU incorporation. So it's not like in the same boat as, say, if Belgium decided they wanted to leave, or even, right? Poland. I mean, would you say Poland is more closely integrated into the EU than Britain is? I think that's the case.
I don't really follow Polish politics too much. They had some sort of election recently, maybe 6 months ago, that again really stirred the pot, and then the new government is starting to oust all the post-communists, I guess, sympathizers that had all these cushy directorial and high-level positions. So there's been a lot of drama in Poland, but I think it's a general turn towards right-wing politics, right-wing sentiments. But again, without actually getting deep into the politics itself, because I didn't mean to bring up Brexit specifically as Brexit, but as a concept of a referendum, of getting the people's opinion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you're going to have a democracy, you're going to have that sort of thing sooner or later. Plato thought democracy was just inherently bad,
Well, that's what I'm getting at. Is it just to do this? Is it just to have a referendum in that sense?
Just to subordinate,
to set a law through consensus.
And you're asking whether it would be just for Plato or for Aristotle?
Within those theories, and then maybe we can go on to others as well.
I would say for Plato, no, definitely not. But for Aristotle, yeah, if you have a democracy in place, that's democratic justice. It's not as good as, like, say, having an aristocracy, or ideally the best state is a really good monarchy where you've got a person who's superlative quality, who's running the show, and then you know, he or she administers everything for the benefit of the entire society. But when does that ever happen? You know?
Yes, not very frequently, no.
Yeah. I mean, you know, if you think about, if we expand this a little bit, you can apply the same sort of regime classification to organizations and how they're set up, how they work. You know, like a university, right? We talk about governance within a university or a corporation, and I don't even think we have anything like a really, in those cases, and those are smaller and more manageable than entire commonwealths. But if you're going to have a democracy, I think Aristotle would say, look, it's not as good as some of these other regimes you could have, but if you do have it in place, then yeah, having referenda makes sense. Just watch out that it doesn't turn into mob rule or an excuse for demagoguery, or don't expect an awful lot of great results out of it. So it's just in one way, right? It's just in the sense that that's what democracy does. It can certainly produce unjust results. You know, and we've seen stuff like this too. And when we talk about regime change, one of the big problems that wasn't thought through on our side adequately when it came to you know, getting our fingers in all these things happening within the Arab world was when you you know, remove essentially a totalitarian dictatorship or some sort of theocracy or something like that, and you then institute a democracy with people who haven't developed, you might say, customs of democratic governance.
How do you differentiate? Sorry, how do you differentiate between a democracy and mob rules?
Oh, well, it's a continuum, right?
Right.
And you know, you can have a democracy with all of the forms of democracy, and it could be run by a criminal syndicate. You know, it could be run by extremists of some sort of political stripe or religious stripe, who just are now going to settle scores. This is why, you know, we couldn't hold Iraq together. We never really managed to, the whole time that we were there, we never managed to pass on power to them in such a way that they would have a functioning democracy.
Well, one distinction I could draw, I think what I'm imagining when you say mob rule, I mean, mob rule and democracy is the same word to me. Now, I differentiate.
Well, that's not a distinction.
Well, okay. A republic has a constitution and votes,
okay,
right?
Yeah.
I understand that, but a democracy is basically you can legislate anything as long as you get whatever majority vote you can. So anything can become legal because the people have chosen it.
Yeah, although I mean, you rarely see anything quite so extreme as that, because it's so volatile that they don't usually survive very long. There have been some examples historically, but usually they do end up, if not becoming a republic where there's representative government that's explicitly put into the Constitution, usually there ends up developing some sort of structure that's similar to that. Otherwise, it just breaks down. You know, the sort of the limit case of democracy in that sense would be these leaderless movements, like you know, Arab Spring or Occupy Wall Street. And you know, we see that like with Occupy Wall Street, they didn't actually get anything done. They occupied a square. They spawned a whole bunch of other, you know, similar uprisings. A lot of pot was smoked. A lot of people did, you know, cool things with poetry or stuff like that, and business went on as usual.
Okay, so let me ask you this. So we've gone from democracy, as I understand it, just anything can be legislated by the people, no restraints, as long as there's enough votes, to a republic that is two things. It has a constitution, and it has the laws voted in by people or by representatives or something like that, right? Well, the Constitution was not formed in a democratic way. So something something informs forming this basis upon which everyone else is restricted to, and whatever votes may come to pass, right?
Yeah.
So the question then becomes, why not in the same fashion implement all the laws as were the Constitution, as opposed to voting into the future? I mean, what is the difference between those two sets?
So what is the difference between like creating a republic in which voting then would take place?
No, the difference is, what is the difference between the things that appear in a constitution versus the laws that are then legislated through a democratic process?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I think there's kind of an old way of seeing this and a newer way of seeing this that's represented in how left and right work here in the States. I mean, ideally, if you put a constitution in place, that's supposed to be the fundamental law, the one that sort of governs what everybody else can do. As it turns out, if you allow amendments of the Constitution, or you have interpretation of it, like what our Supreme Court does, right? Then the Constitution changes over time, and the Constitution itself becomes politicized. And so, you know, we have two different main camps of seeing that these days. One is that, you know, we need to like stick to what the original stuff says, and then the other one is, well, it's this living, breathing document, right? And then your point would be, if it's a living, breathing document, how is that any different than just the rest of the political system and engaging in you know, lawmaking that way, right?
That's one part of it, but I think the formation of the Constitution takes a basis that is not itself democratic to come to those laws, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's supposed to be representative, but it's not. It is. So it's representative and it's democratic insofar as those who are the representatives all get together and hash things out, right? But not everybody gets their foot in the door, and there could be kind of a proportionate thing, like, you know, as far as I understand the development of our Constitution, it's not as if we had weighted votes based on the size of the states at that time.
No, it was an elite class that just decided it for everybody, right?
Yeah, but each state had to sign on. And so, you know, a small state like Rhode Island had as much say in it as, say, did New York. Although, practically speaking, the big powerhouse players were coming from places like Virginia and, let's see, Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania. Those were where I'd say the bulk of the movers and shakers came from. But yeah, it wasn't democratic, and it wasn't elite deciding it. But you know, it kept a lot of democratic elements. There's votes for, you know, every 4 years for who's going to be president, and you get to vote for your representatives, and so no, it feels democratic, you know.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the general line is that those things that would have been put into any constitution, not specifically just the American one, but any constitution that is formed on a non-democratic process where it's a group of people just deciding these things, right? They're drawing on some basis that they feel is a correct basis on which to build law, right?
Oh, and you're asking what is that basis?
Yes, and that basis has to obviously be different from the basis of anything that follows in terms of law after the fact.
Well, yeah, it has to be distinct. It doesn't necessarily have to be totally different. I mean, if you think about the French Revolution and the formation of their, you know, their political system after that, you've got representation, but they're claiming that they're representing the general will of the populace or the people against the monarchy. Now, of course, you know, what the hell is that? I don't really know what a general will is. I mean, I've read Rousseau, but, you know, I couldn't say what it is even for America. We're an intensely fragmented country too, by the way.
But what's important in Rousseau is that the general will is always right.
Well, it's right by definition. If you're wrong by definition, but then it turns into an object very quickly of who gets to control what counts as the general will, and that's when the terror begins, and starts claiming victims from the people who even got it started. So I don't know that we want to take that as a good model. But I think in different cases, and these usually start with revolutions, right? Historically, against somebody else who's got that land under their control.
Right, but the example of the French Revolution is a good one because you call out exactly that the motivating factor for it was a philosophical basis, right? It was I suppose a Rousseauian philosophical basis of this one particular set of, the social contract, the good, the general will, and things like that. That was the basis of it, right?
More or less, yeah. I mean, and you can say the American one did too. The Federalist Papers occupy a similar kind of role ideologically. And then we could think about like what happens throughout the South American republics. It's similar processes in place where it's not everybody who's in on the formation, but you do get a republic here and a republic there.
Interesting.
I suppose popular sovereignty, not in the sense of everybody getting to vote, but as somehow you're the representative of the people is the basis for most of these new constitutions. Don't you think?
Well, yes. No, I'm saying is that whatever is because we've been talking about consensus as a medium by which laws come into being. So those sort of constitutions, I wouldn't consider really much of consensus. Sure, it's not necessarily one individual, but a small group of them. But it would never be considered consensus of any large group of people, right? Of the masses, it wouldn't be considered a democratic thing. So the formation of those laws, the constitutional laws, has to be something else. And like we identified here with the French Revolution, that would have been Rousseauian politics. It would have been this philosophical model that Rousseau had presented. Yeah. So, yeah, no, I'm just saying that this stuff, as it relates to justice in the law, right? They seem to be related in a curious way, but always somehow through some philosophical frame.
Yeah, I'd say that's right. Even if it isn't explicitly philosophical, it'll usually turn out to be implicitly philosophical, and then it can be reconstructed later on, by whoever wants to work it through, you might say. I mean, so you can see like Hobbes. If we're not talking about republics, but we're talking about other forms. Hobbes, in his analysis of the English Civil War and Cromwell's essentially first modern totalitarian state, he's sort of reconstructing after the fact what he takes to have gone on there. And the French Revolution spawned a whole literature trying to figure out what the hell happened, But I suppose the American Revolution too. That's still like an ongoing debate, right, between the left and the right here in the United States. What does it mean?
Yeah, I don't know. But even looking at like the basic laws within any constitution, do you think that they are moral in nature?
In any constitution, like the notion of we're going to have some way of living together, and here's how it's going to be from now on.
That's right. Yeah.
Is that moral? I would say it serves moral ends, in that we don't want too much contestation all the time about just what we're doing. We want some things to be settled so we can get along with each other and get on with like living and raising families and making, goods and services and all of that sort of stuff. But is it moral in and of itself? Like, does it have a transcendent moral value? Maybe is that what you're asking?
No, I'm saying these are constitutions as I see them. As well, the American one. If you look at the language, they seem to be legislating morality explicitly. The very basic aspects of it.
You mean like in the preamble where it says what it's for, to promote the general happiness and that sort of
Well,
thing.
yes. See, again, to say the pursuit of happiness, and happiness is a higher, one of the highest goals,
Yeah.
which is very reflective of Aristotle as well, in terms of the good, pursuit of happiness.
Yeah. Although the American Constitution is much more from a Lockean point of view. It's
No, I understand, but all I'm getting at is that those basic kind of laws seem to be legislated morality. They make statements about the human condition. They make very
yeah,
wide sweeping statements about the nature of people in relationship to each other, right?
yeah, I'd say that's right. They're certainly articulating a moral point of view, right?
Yeah.
For each of them, there's you could put them side by side, and you could say this one has more of this value than of that value in comparison to this other constitution.
Well, the reason I bring this up is kind of the kind of the separation between justice and ethics itself. It seems to be in constitutions there really is no real division between in terms of law and ethics.
In terms of the constitutions themselves, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. In terms of how they get interpreted, then, though, and like say we have our Supreme Court, sometimes moral concerns will come up. Other things too, policy concerns. Well, does this actually make sense to interpret it this way, or is this going to impose too huge of a burden upon the state or on certain actors, or make it too difficult to get goods across state lines? Those sorts of things come up as well. But yeah, moral concerns come up. So you could say that at the beginning, maybe this is actually one of the fundamental dynamics in politics. At the beginning, there's always a nice coincidence, at least seemingly, between law and ethics, right? And then as time goes on, it starts to become clear that they're diverging further and further. And then the question is, well, how do we get them back together? And every time you ask that question, people have different answers to it, so they start arguing about that as well. And the question is, can they get along well enough to bring them back together, or are they going to totally fall apart?
Well, I find it just funny that that there's a belief that's fairly common amongst people that you shouldn't legislate morality.
Yeah.
But if we do accept that the Constitution itself is legislated morality, we come to this kind of contradiction.
I mean, if you want to combat that old trope, I don't even think you have to go to constitutions. You just look at the rest of the laws that we have, and you can look at the motivators of the lawmakers. Sometimes it's actually in the law. It says, in order to produce this effect, we're doing that. Pretty much all the law that we make is either to make things work well, in which case it's for the value of expediency or utility, ultimately leading to some sort of good, or it's explicitly about moral concerns and reflecting moral values. It's just a question of which ones are going to be dominant and who's are going to be acknowledged as that. So usually when I hear a person say something like, well, you can't legislate morality, I just quit listening to them after that, because anything that they're going to have to say after that is probably just propaganda or just poorly thought out stuff. Just like there's other tropes that kind of give away that a person is. I also this is a total digression, but I've also come in recent years when I hear a person here in the States say, "I'm a political news junkie," I just get away from them as quickly as possible, because usually they don't know anything about political theory. They just watch a lot of either Fox or CNN or MSNBC, and they're on the right or they're on the left, and they're going to spout some stuff at me.
Yeah, normally I know nothing of what's happening in politics, but I focus more on the literature itself, the philosophical stuff, especially like Robert Wolff in Defense of Anarchism is a very interesting.
Oh yeah. I haven't gotten it down from the shelf, but I was looking at that the other day on my shelf and thinking I should get that down. It's such a nice short book, and I haven't seen anyone reference that for quite a while, but it's worth a read.
Oh, it's fantastic, especially to a lot of people that are very committed to democracy itself. showcases, at least to me, a very interesting objective view of democracy that is neither slandering but attempting to resolve the moral dilemma between, you know, the state and ethics. I find that being very, very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember reading that as an undergraduate. This is a long time ago, 20 years, more than 20 years ago, and being really happy as I was, you know, working my way through the arguments. Yeah.
Very good. Well, I have no more questions in relationship to, I guess, law and justice. I think we've covered a great deal here. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up, Dr. Sadler, here, as long as we're on the subject?
With respect to law and justice, no. But I mean, I'm looking forward. There's a, you know, the question of justice. There's so many different facets to it. So I think it'll be a lot of fun to talk through some of these other ones, like you mentioned, equality and inequality.
Yes, but that, again, that's its own topic, its own can of worms, I think. I tried to steer away from certain things that had contextual relevance in this conversation, but we'll just leave them for the next one.
That sounds good.
Cool. So if there's nothing else from your side, I guess maybe we've been going for about an hour, 40 minutes. Maybe we'll wrap up.
Sounds good.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Sadler, for yet another awesome talk. I think this series is going to be of particular interest to a lot of people, since it deals with something so immediate and expedient like justice, which we're all familiar with, and especially in the online social space, we deal with social justice warriors. We deal with these concepts all the time, so it will be fun to kind of cover them more from a philosophical point of view. As for for you, Dr. Sadler, I'm going to put the links to Reason.io. So for those who may be watching this interview as the first one with myself and Dr. Sadler runs his own consultancy, Reason.io. He does philosophical counseling as well as teaching. I will be putting the links to his website as well as to his YouTube channel, which is awesome. You should check it out if you want to get some really in-depth detail about Aristotle, Plato, and a whole bunch of other philosophers. So thank you, Dr. Sadler, for attending, and I look forward to our talk on equality next time.
All right. It's always great talking with you, Marcus.
All right. Cheers. Have a good one.